Hi, my name's Tim Bain, and this is the final installment in a series of lectures on the problem, or rather problems, of other minds that I'm recording for the Moscow Center for Consciousness Studies. In previous lectures, I've focused both on the traditional or skeptical problem of other minds and on what I've called the scientific problem of other minds. The traditional problem of other minds concerns our access to the conscious states of ordinary adult human beings. We assume that we have fairly good access to the conscious lives of other people and that we can tell when they are conscious and, roughly speaking, what kinds of conscious states they're in. The skeptic, however, argues that these assumptions aren't justified and that reliable access to consciousness doesn't extend much beyond one's own mind. The scientific problem of other minds is concerned with cases, in previous lectures I've called them contested cases, in which there is genuine scientific debate about the presence or, as it were, absence of consciousness. As we've seen, contested cases arise in the context of non-responsive patients who have experienced severe brain damage, human fetuses and neonates, non-human animals of various kinds, and perhaps also in AI systems. Although the scientific problem of other minds is, of course, a problem for the science of consciousness, it's also a philosophical problem, or it raises philosophical problems. And that's because the basic challenge posed by the scientific problem isn't that we don't have enough data, although it's certainly true that in many cases we don't have enough data, but rather that we don't quite know what kinds of data would be relevant or is needed in order to answer questions about consciousness when it comes to creatures of other kinds. Do we need data about their behavior? Do we need data about their material constitution, what they're made of? Do we need data about their functional or informational states? Not only is there a disagreement about the kinds of information that we need to answer questions about consciousness and other types of creatures, more fundamentally, it's unclear how we might go about adjudicating that dispute. It's unclear how we might decide what kinds of information we need in order to answer these questions. In an earlier lecture, I sketched an answer to this last problem that I've called the natural kind approach. In a nutshell, the natural kind approach recommends that we approach the problem of validating putative measures of consciousness in the way that we approach validation problems in many other parts of science, and that is, we treat the phenomenon in question as a natural kind. More particularly, we start with our ordinary pre-theoretical markers of the phenomenon and look to see if there's an underlying feature that explains why those markers pattern together, why they cluster together in the ways that we do. If we find such a feature, or potentially features, we would then be in a position to revise and supplement the initial suite of pre-theoretical markers with which we started. And if we could do that, we could then begin to address the challenge posed by the scientific problem of other minds. What I want to do in this lecture is change tack a little bit and consider an aspect of the problem of other minds that isn't really addressed by the natural kind approach, or at least not directly. The focus of the natural kind approach is the problem of creature consciousness. That is, the problem of identifying which entities are conscious and which aren't. It's concerned with whether there's something it's like to be, for example, a fish, a newborn baby, or an AI system. But in addition to asking whether there's something it's like to be an X, we might also ask what it's like to be an X, a particular kind of entity. I'm going to call this latter question the character question. The character question is, of course, the focus of Thomas Nagel's famous paper, What is it like to be a bat? It's also the question that I'm going to focus on in this lecture, or rather, it's the type of question that I'm going to focus on here, for I'm not going to say a great deal about bats. But before I turn explicitly to the character question, I want to reflect a little bit on how the character question is related to what I've just called the creature question. That is, I want to ask how the question of what it's like to be an X is related to the question of whether it's like anything at all to be an X. Or rather, I want to ask how the epistemology of finding out, how our methods for finding out whether there's something that's like to be an X are related to our methods for finding out whether there's something it's like to be an X. The first point to note is that certain ways of approaching the creature question must, if they're successful, presuppose a kind of answer to the character question. What I mean by this is, it can be explained in terms of this example. So you might argue that a creature is conscious on the grounds that the best explanation of its behavior involves ascribing to it a perceptual experience of some kind. But because only a conscious organism can have perceptual experiences, it follows that the creature in question must be conscious. If it's got a perceptual experience, it must be conscious. This approach then would tie the creature question to the character question. We first answer the character question, and in so doing, we answer the creature question. But there are other ways of approaching the creature question that don't engage with the character question directly, that as it were, don't tell us anything about what it's like to be the creature in question. Consider an approach to the detection of consciousness developed by the Italian neuroscientist Marcello Massimini and his collaborators at the University of Milan, an approach that involves what's known as the Perturbational Complexity Index, or PCI. PCI is measured, involves a two-step process. First, the brain is zapped with transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, and then in the second step, EEG is used to measure the complexity of the cortical response to TMS. And the basic idea here is there's a lot of complexity, but in the details, but the basic idea is that higher levels of complexity, as measured by the Perturbational Complexity Index, provide an indicator of consciousness, at least in human beings, while low levels of complexity, as measured by the PCI, are indicative of the absence of consciousness. The relevant point here is that PCI doesn't measure conscious content. It doesn't measure the character of a person's consciousness. It tells us nothing about what it's like to be them. But it tells us really only, if it tells us anything at all, that is, if it's a valid measure of consciousness, it tells us whether or not they're conscious. It might also tell us something about their level of consciousness. I'm not interested here in the very important question of whether PCI has been validated or precisely how one might validate it. I think one could try to validate it via the natural kind method. But I mention it merely to illustrate the point that there are ways of approaching the creature question that don't address the character question, that are neutral on the character question. What about the converse relationship? Could one address the character question without also addressing the creature question? In considering this issue, it's useful to ask why Nagel decided to focus on bats in his famous paper. In part, he says, his decision was motivated by the fact that bats, rather than many other types of creatures, such as, he gives the example of wasps or flounders, a type of fish, because, and this is a quote, we all believe that bats have experience, whereas, quote, if one travels too far down the phylogenetic tree, people gradually shed their faith that there is experience there at all, end of quote. Now, I'm not so sure that we do all believe that bats have experience. I've certainly encountered people, and I've certainly read discussions of consciousness where people are ambivalent or agnostic or uncertain about whether bats are conscious. But I won't dwell on that point here. I'm certainly happy to grant that it's very likely that bats are conscious. The point I want to make is that Nagel focused on bats because he wanted to presuppose an affirmative answer to the creature question. He didn't want to ask the character question, what is it like to be an X, for a creature where it's unclear whether there's anything it's like to be an X. And that approach seems eminently reasonable. After all, it hardly makes sense to ask what it's like to be a bat, unless there is something it's like to be a bat. But although it's true that giving an account of what it's like to be something presupposes that there is something it's like to be that creature, it seems to me that we can approach the character question with respect to a particular type of creature without first taking a stance on whether creatures of that kind are conscious. Rather than presupposing an affirmative answer to the creature question as Nagel does, we could treat the character question as a conditional. In other words, we could focus on the following question: what would it be like to be a bat, if indeed there's anything it's like to be a bat at all? And in fact, this general strategy might be quite a reasonable one to adopt in many contexts. For it might be possible to say quite a bit about the kinds of experiences that a creature could have, even if we're unable to answer the question of whether it has experiences at all. For example, we might not be able to figure out whether the members of a certain species, say bees, are conscious, but we might be able to tell that they lack the machinery necessary for certain types of conscious experiences, say experiences of pain. And that might be really well worth knowing. It might be useful for us to know that they can't experience pain, even if we're unsure as to whether or not they can have experiences at all. So, although the character question and the creature question are very closely related, and there are ways of answering each question which presuppose an affirmative answer to the other question, there are reasons why we might want to separate them out, and there's a certain way in which we can separate them out, or at least certain methods for tackling each question allow us to remain neutral on the other question. All right, enough stage setting, enough preamble. Let's turn now to the character question itself. How might we be able to figure out what it's like to be a certain kind of creature? Indeed, can we figure out what it's like to be a certain type of creature? Now, in engaging with these questions, there's really no better place to begin than with Nagel's famous paper, the paper we've just been talking about, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Although Nagel's focus in that paper is on the metaphysics of consciousness and the intelligibility of the claim that consciousness could be a physical phenomenon, much of its discussion there is concerned with epistemic issues of the kind that we're interested in here. Indeed, on one reading of Nagel's paper, his worries about the intelligibility of physicalism are driven by his skepticism about our capacity to know what it's like to be a bat. Roughly, the argument is that if physicalism or materialism were intelligible, then we would be able to figure out what it's like to be a bat, but since we can't, it isn't. At any rate, I'm going to focus on the epistemic strands in Nagel's paper and leave to one side questions about the metaphysics of consciousness. So, according to Nagel, what exactly is the problem that we face when it comes to figuring out what it's like to be a bat? Well, let's start with what the problem isn't, what the problem, according to him, isn't. The problem, I take it, as he sees it, isn't evidential. It's not a problem about hypothesis selection. Consider someone who proposes three hypotheses about what it's like to be a bat. Hypothesis A, hypothesis B, hypothesis C. A certain kind of skeptic might worry that we won't ever be able to figure out which of these three hypotheses is right. Perhaps, they might argue, to decide between them, we would need to draw inferences from the bats about the bat's experience from its behavior or its neurophysiology, and we could never know which of those inferences was justified and which was unjustified. But it's pretty clear, I think, that Nagel's not defending a worry of that kind. Nagel's worry isn't concerned with hypothesis selection, but with what we might call hypothesis formation. His worry is that we can't even conceive of what it's like to be a bat. We can't even grasp the hypotheses that correctly describe the bat's phenomenology or the bat's experiential perspective. Why does Nagel think that there's a problem here? Well, here's my reconstruction of his main argument. It's got three premises and then the conclusion. First premise gives us a disjunction, an either or. In order to understand what it's like to be a bat, we'd either need to extrapolate from our own experience or we'd need to rely on scientific methods. We can't understand what it's like to be a bat by extrapolating from our own case, for the states that characterize a bat's experience are too unlike our own to be grasped by extrapolating from our own case. But we can't rely on the methods of science either, for, and this is a quote, we are completely unequipped to think about the subjective character of experience without relying on the imagination, without taking up the point of view of the experiential subject. And science doesn't allow us to do that, end quote. Well, sorry, the quote ended before with the phrase, without taking up the point of view of the experiential subject. Conclusion, we can't understand, we can't conceive of, we can't grasp what it's like to be a bat. I'm going to call this argument Nagel's challenge. In effect, the argument confronts us with a dilemma, arguing that there are really only two possible routes to knowledge of what it's like to be a bat, and neither route is viable. And of course, Nagel's point isn't just about bats. As we've already noted, he focuses on bats in part because he thinks we're pretty confident that bats are conscious. But if Nagel's challenge is sound, then it's going to problematize our capacity to understand or grasp any kind of alien subjectivity. That is, the point of view of any kind of creature who occupies a location in phenomenal space that's far removed from that which we occupy. So, what should we make of Nagel's challenge? Well, it seems to me the argument's clearly valid. And it seems to me also that the first premise, that in order to understand what it's like to be a bat, we're going to need to extrapolate from our own experience or somehow rely on scientific methods, is pretty plausible. At least I can't think of a third way, a way of evading the two horns of the dilemma that Nagel confronts us with. So if we're going to push back against this argument, we're going to need to either show that it's possible to extrapolate from our own experience to the experience of a bat or some other alien phenomenology, or we're going to need to show that the methods of science might enable us to conceive of what it's like to be a bat. How about the first horn of the dilemma? Could we understand what it's like to be a bat by extrapolating from our own case? Nagel, of course, argues that we can't, suggesting that echolocation, the perceptual modality that's most distinctive of bats, is so unlike the kinds of perceptual modalities that we have, that we rely on, that we won't be able to bridge the gap between our own experience and the bats. As a number of people have pointed out, Nagel's choice of example here is rather unfortunate, for it turns out that echolocation isn't completely alien to human beings. Some individuals, particularly those who have been blind from early in life, are actually expert echolocators and use clicks that they produce to generate spatial maps of their environment, which are remarkably detailed. In fact, one individual, Daniel Kish, is so good at using echolocation to build up a representation of his environment that he can rely on this capacity to ride a bike. There are videos on YouTube of him using this capacity. The Canadian neuroscientist Mel Goodale has also shown that even those of us who aren't blind appear to have some capacity to detect rudimentary spatial information via echolocation. So, although some theorists take the fact that many of us have some capacity for echolocation to undermine Nagel's use of this example, I'm actually not sure that that's right. In fact, it seems to me, if anything, the fact that we turn out to have some capacity for echolocation seems to strengthen Nagel's point, if you think about it. But Nagel might argue that the fact that we can't imagine what it's like to be a bat, even though we have some echolocatory abilities, reinforces his basic point. Namely, that we can conceive of what it's like to have a particular experiential point of view only for creatures who are very close to us in phenomenal space. That when it comes to creatures who have a very different experiential point of view, we can't imagine that, even if it involves a capacity that we have, even if that experiential point of view involves a capacity that we share. So another way to put this point is, although we might be closer in phenomenal space, as it were, to bats than we might have assumed, than Nagel assumes, the fact that our echolocatory abilities aren't well developed means that we aren't close enough. Note, however, that this line of thought, this line of argument, might indicate that those with really advanced, really sophisticated echolocatory capacities, like Daniel Kish, for example, might in fact be able to imagine what it's like to be a bat, even if the rest of us, who perhaps have some ability to echolocate, but very, very impoverished abilities, can't really imagine what it's like to be a bat. At any rate, the issue of human echolocation is a bit of a red herring, I think. For Nagel's argument can simply be recast in terms of a perceptual capacity that we clearly do lack, such as the capacity to see ultraviolet colors. And I'm assuming here, I think reasonably, that no human beings have the capacity to see ultraviolet light, ultraviolet colors. Birds do have this capacity, and presumably the colors that they experience, ultraviolet colors, are very different from the kind of colors that we can experience. Their color experiences are very different. Again, the problem isn't that we're not in a position to tell which of various competing hypotheses about ultraviolet phenomenology, or the phenomenology of perceiving ultraviolet colors, is true. Is it like this? Is it like that? Is it like that? The problem, really, intuitively, is that we can't even entertain the relevant hypotheses in the first place. We can't even imagine, as it were, or grasp the hypothesis that might accurately describe what it's like to perceive ultraviolet colors. So, although Nagel's particular focus on echolocation is Perhaps unfortunate, I think that's debatable, but it's certainly distracting from his main point. It seems to me that there's a lot to be said in defense of the first horn of his dilemma. We can't, I think, grasp alien phenomenology by extrapolating from our own case. But what about the second horn of Nagel's dilemma? Might science be able to make alien phenomenology scrutable? Might it be able to shed light on what it's like to have an alien point of view in the way that birds who can see ultraviolet colors do? I want to explore this question by reflecting on what I think is one of the most interesting responses to Nagel's paper, a paper by Kathleen Akins, A Bat Without Qualities. The idea at the heart of Akins's paper is that the character of a bat's experience, what it's like to be a bat, can be understood in terms of how the bat represents the world. A point of view, Akins says, quote, is not a jumble of qualia. And by that I take it she means pure phenomenal character, pure phenomenal properties, raw feels. Continue the quotation. In the normal, non-pathological subject, consciousness is systematic, representational, and intentional. Brackets, e.g., we represent objects as being a certain way of a certain type. End quote. And as she says elsewhere in the paper, quote, it's not clear that we do know how to separate our conscious experiences into two parts, the representational and the qualitative aspects, or whether, indeed, this notion even makes sense, end quote. So, at the heart of Akins's response to Nagel is the idea that he goes wrong by focusing on presupposing that there's a purely qualitative aspect of experience that's non-representational, it's non-intentional, it's not directed at the world. And if we reject that assumption, we have at least the beginnings of a way of a response to his challenge, and we have the beginnings of an account of how we might understand or grasp alien phenomenologies. So on my reading, Akins' central argument goes something like this. First premise, what it's like to be a bat, that is, the nature of the bat's point of view, is a matter of how the bat represents the world. Second premise, science can, at least in principle, discover how the bat represents the world. Therefore, science can discover what it's like to be a bat. I'm going to call this the representational response. Pardon me. There are two key moves implicit in the representational response. The first move involves an appeal to a representational account of phenomenal character or experiential character, the what it's likeness of consciousness. According to a representational account, what it's like to have a certain type of experience is determined by what that experience represents, its representational content, as philosophers put it. The second move in the representational response involves an appeal to the idea that science can identify an experience's representational content, that representational content is scientifically scrutable. I'm going to consider these 2 points, these 2 ideas, these 2 claims in reverse order. Now, in principle, it would be possible to hold that although the phenomenal character of an experience is fixed by its representational content, that fact doesn't really help us with the challenge of alien phenomenology, because representational content, or at least representational content that's alien to us, is inscrutable from the third person perspective. It's not scrutable, not recoverable, not identifiable by science. But although that view certainly represents a possible position, it doesn't have a great deal to recommend it, or at least so it seems to me. Appeals to representation and representational content are ubiquitous in cognitive science. The basic idea that internal representations are explanatory posits that account for an organism's perceptual and cognitive capacities, explain an organism's behavior, is a very commonly endorsed and has, I think, a lot going for it. That said, it might be difficult in practice to determine what contents we should assign to the states of a target entity, for example, a human infant or a non-human animal or an AI system. It doesn't look as though there are going to be any principal obstacles here, given that most influential accounts of representational content take content to be determined by features of the system that are in principle open to scientific scrutiny. In fact, I suspect the real problem here is that we're likely to suffer from an embarrassment of riches, and that there are going to be too many plausible accounts of representational content. Some accounts of content are output focused and appeal to the behavior of an organism, to how the organism uses that representation to explain what its content is. Some accounts are input focused and appeal to the factors that are responsible for triggering that representation to assign content to the representation. And some accounts appeal to both perceptual input and behavioral input, perceptual input and behavioral output. Cross-cutting that debate is a debate as to what kinds of factors, be they on the input side or the output side, fixed representational content. Are they purely proximal factors that might be defined in terms of neural states or bodily states? Or do they perhaps involve distal factors, factors that might be defined in environmental terms? Some accounts of representational content appeal only to here and now factors that are currently available in the organism's environment. Other accounts, for example, the teleosemantic account, famously developed by Ruth Millikan and others, holds that representational content is determined not just by what a system's various components are able to do, but what they've been designed to do, by what their proper functions are, as she puts it. So there's a whole plethora of accounts of what fixes representational content. Some of these accounts might turn out not to be viable for some reason or another, but I suspect many of them will turn out to capture a notion of representational content that's useful for certain purposes. And some of these accounts, although they might assign the same content to certain representations, others, there will be cases, rather, in which they assign different contents to different representations. And if that's right, then we're going to be faced with questions about precisely what content to ascribe to a particular experience. We may be faced with a kind of content pluralism, that we have different accounts of content, each of which are viable, each of which seem to be useful from a theoretical point of view in explaining an organism's behavior, but they don't agree on the same content assignments to a representation. Now, for certain purposes, a kind of content pluralism seems unobjectionable, but content pluralism, it seems to me, is problematic in the present context, for it would lead to a kind of pluralism about phenomenal character, or at least it threatens to. And pluralism about phenomenal character, the idea that experience might have multiple, very different phenomenal characters, very different what its likenesses, as it were, doesn't seem to me to be all that attractive. What it's like to have a particular type of experience doesn't seem, I think, to depend on one's explanatory purposes in the way that representational content might do. So the main challenge here, I think, isn't that representational content turns out to be scientifically inscrutable, but rather that, in a way, it turns out to be too scrutable, in the sense that there might be multiple ways of assigning content to a representation, no ways of adjudicating between rival attributions of content. Many of the rival accounts might be plausible, so we might be forced to adopt a kind of pluralism, but that pluralism arguably threatens to lead to a kind of untenable pluralism about phenomenal character. So that, I think, is the main challenge with respect to the scientific scrutability of representational content. There's more to be said about that challenge, but I want to move now to the second part of the representational response, which is where the action, I think, is going to be. I think this is where most people are going to push back on the representational response to Nagel's challenge, namely the appeal to representationalism about phenomenal character. As I've noted, representationalism is the view that what it's like to be a particular kind of entity, what it's like to have a particular kind of experience, is determined by representational facts. It can be captured, in the first instance at least, by an appeal to representational content. Now, representationalism, sometimes also called intentionalism, is a very influential view in the philosophy of mind, but it's also a very controversial view. There are, on my reading of the literature, two main kinds of objections to representationalism. One objection takes issue with the entire representationalist picture, arguing that no aspect of phenomenology, no phenomenal character, is determined by representational properties, that all phenomenal character is, as it were, purely qualitative. One recent advocate of this kind of objection is David Papineau, who in his recent book, the metaphysics of sensory experience, has developed a number of objections to representationalism, arguing that it's the wrong kind of account. It tells the wrong kind of story to explain phenomenal character. On Papineau's view, even spatial phenomenology, even the phenomenal character of seeing objects around one as occupying various regions of space, as bearing various spatial properties to each other, isn't determined by representational content. Now, Papineau's objections and others like them are important, but it would take me too far away from current concerns to engage with those objections here. Instead, I'm going to focus on a second kind of objection to representationalism, which concerns not its principled capacity to account for phenomenal character, but its adequacy as a comprehensive theory of phenomenal character. Those who develop this objection might, and typically do, allow that representationalism is true of many types of experiences, particularly those that involve spatial or temporal phenomenology, phenomenal character. But they insist that there are certain types of experiences whose phenomenal character can't be captured, or at least can't be fully captured, by appeal to representational facts. The worry, in other words, here, is that even if some version of restricted representationalism is true, what we might call unrestricted representationalism, that is a kind of representationalism that is adequate to capturing all kinds of phenomenal character, is implausible. Now, I think there's very good reason to take this kind of objection very, very seriously. After all, even some of representationalism's most ardent fans have stopped short of embracing unrestricted representationalism. I'm thinking here particularly of Fred Dretske, whose influential book, 1995 book, Naturalizing the Mind, did much to establish representationalism's credentials. In that book, Dretske focuses on perception and says quite explicitly he's not sure whether representationalism might capture certain other aspects of phenomenology. Indeed, Akins herself doesn't explicitly deny that there might be elements of human experience that float free of representational content. Her claim isn't so much that representationalism leaves nothing unaccounted for, nothing in phenomenology accounted for, but that what it does account for captures the central elements of what it's like to be a certain type of creature. To quote from her again, quote, "A point of view is not a jumble of qualia, that is, raw experiential feels. In the normal non-pathological subject, consciousness is systematic, representational, and intentional." That leaves open, of course, that there might be, as it were, pathological cases in which you get pure qualia. You might get aspects of experience that are not systematic, representational, or intentional. And there might even be some aspects of phenomenology in normal, ordinary experience which have that character. I'm going to shortly examine a number of challenges, a number of potential counterexamples to unrestricted representationalism. But first, I want to briefly consider the implications of this issue for the prospects of what I've been calling the representationalist response to Nagel's challenge. In other words, would it matter if representationalism were able to capture only certain forms of phenomenal character and left many other kinds of experiences unaccounted for, or does it need to be, or does representationalism need to be unrestricted in order to have any plausibility here? I think the answer to this question depends on two things. First, it depends on just how restricted representationalism would be. The representationalist response would, I think, be relatively unscathed if it turns out that representation left unaccounted only a few esoteric and rarely experienced forms of phenomenology. If, on the other hand, it failed to account for a great many ordinary forms of experience, and in particular, forms of experience that we care a lot about, such as aspects of affective experience, then that would be a different matter. And then I think the viability, the plausibility of the representationalist response might be in jeopardy. The second issue that's relevant here concerns the epistemic implications of the alternatives to representationalism. The failure of unrestricted representationalism might not matter much if it turned out that there are viable non-representationalist responses to Nagel's challenge. However, if representationalism turns out to be pretty much the only game in town, then any restriction in the scope of representationalism might be much more serious. I'm not going to consider the prospects of non-representationalist responses to Nagel here, but for what it's worth, it seems to me that they're rather dim and nowhere near as attractive, nowhere near as strong as the prospects of responses that involve appeals to representationalism. So, with those points in mind, let's take a look at some of the main challenges to unrestricted representationalism, focusing on features of ordinary, everyday, non-pathological experience. It seems to me that there are three domains in which the representationalist faces tough challenges. The first involves what are called secondary qualities of perception: colors, tastes, flavors, smells, and so on. Although our experience of these phenomena treats them as properties of external objects, the strawberry looks to be red, seems to be sweet, the sweetness is experienced as a property of the strawberry, the redness is experienced as a property of the strawberry. The status of redness and sweetness has been problematic since at least the time of Galileo, if not earlier. And many, looking at what science has told us about color and flavor, have concluded that physical objects like strawberries don't really have colors or flavors, at least not in the way in which they have primary qualities such as location, shape, size, mass, and so on. On this view, the strawberry's color and flavor aren't genuine properties of the strawberry. Instead, they reside only in our experience of the strawberry, and we somehow project them onto strawberries and other objects that are red or sweet. The redness, the sweetness, the quality we're directly aware of and experience is really a property of ourselves. It's a property of our experience. It's a raw feel. Now, although this position doesn't require the rejection of physicalism, one could identify qualia with brain states or functional states, it certainly problematizes the representationalist response, for in a sense, the whole point of representationalism is to get sensory qualities out of the mind and put them back into the world. Of course, it's possible for the representationalist to hold a view on which our experiences of colors and flavors are always non-vertical, and that although the experience of sensory qualities is determined by the representation of various properties, it's determined by representational content, the properties in question are never actually instantiated in the actual world. Dave Chalmers has developed a view a bit like this, and he calls these properties that are represented in color and flavor experience, but not instantiated, calls these properties Edenic properties, a term that's meant to invoke in certain ways the Garden of Eden. Now, this Edenic property, an appeal to Edenic properties, might allow that there's a sense in which strawberries are red, but they aren't red in the sense of instantiating the properties that we ascribe to them when we experience them as red. They are not Edenically red, as it were. They're not Edenically sweet. So that is a possible representationalist view, but it doesn't strike me as a particularly attractive. And in particular, I mean, the main problem, as I see it, is accounting for Edenic content. It's giving a story as to what grounds Edenic content, where Edenic content comes from. Standard accounts of content hold that a representation represents a certain property because it stands in a certain kind of relation to instantiations of that property. But given that nothing in the actual world instantiates Edenic redness or Edenic sweetness, it doesn't seem possible for accounts of that kind to explain the existence of Edenic content. We can put the problem this way. If a color experience has the phenomenal character that it does because of some relation that the experience, bears to colors, then we could explain why this experience is an experience of red and this one's an experience of green. But if the character of a color experience is taken to be primitive in the way that the Edenic kind of approach does, and isn't to be explained in terms of relations between experiences of colors and colors themselves, then we have no such explanation to offer. The upshot, it seems to me, is that the representationalist is going to want to, perhaps really going to have to, push back against what is often taken to be the scientific consensus, and to find a place for colors, flavors, and so on in the physical world. Not just experiences of colors, flavors, and so on, but actual colors. They're going to need to find a story on which the strawberry itself really is red, really is sweet. There are various proposals for how that might be done. For example, some have suggested that an object's color can be identified with its surface spectral reflectance profile rather. But I'm not going to evaluate that proposal or any other proposal here. I'm just going to note that it's an open question whether any proposal along those lines might actually succeed. There's a challenge here for representationalism. A second domain in which representationalism face challenges concerns bodily sensations, experiences of pain, itches, tickles, and so on. Like experiences of secondary qualities, colors and flavors, bodily sensations appear to be intentional. They appear to be directed towards certain regions of one's body. A pain might seem to be located in one's right foot. An itch, for example, might seem to be located in your left shoulder. In that sense, bodily sensations have at least some representational content. But it's far from obvious that every aspect of the phenomenal character of a pain or an itch or a tickle can be captured in terms of by appeal to representational content. There are a couple of ways in which this worry might be explained or developed. Some theorists focus on the idea that it doesn't make sense to treat bodily sensations as having veridicality conditions, as being veridical or non-veridical. If your right foot feels as though it's in pain, they say, then it is in pain. There's no possibility of a gap between how things seem and how they are with respect to bodily sensations. But if experiences of pain were representational, were representations, the argument goes, then there would be such a gap, because it would always be an open question whether the relevant body part had the property ascribed to it by the relevant sensation. Another way of developing this kind of worry focuses not on the question of veridicality, but on the nature of the properties that bodily sensations might ascribe to body parts. What, for example, does having a pain in one's right foot say about one's foot? What property does an experience of pain ascribe to one's foot? What property does an itch in one's shoulder ascribe to one's shoulder? What exactly is the nature of these properties? This is in a way related, well, it's very closely related to the question about what veridicality. What would it take for an experience of a pain or an itch to be veridical? There are, of course, representationalist answers to these questions. For example, some representationalists argue that there doesn't seem to be the possibility of a gap between appearance and reality when it comes to bodily sensations, but only because the thing that our terms for bodily sensations denote isn't the object of those representations, but the representation itself, the experience itself. That's why there doesn't seem to be a gap between having an experience of pain and being in pain. Being in pain, the way we use the term, simply refers to the experience. And representationalists have also offered accounts of the content of bodily sensations. For example, some representationalists argue that experiences of pain represent the relevant body part as damaged in some way. Others, a less standard kind of version of representationalism, other accounts argue that pains are imperatives rather than indicatives. They don't describe how things are. They don't describe one's foot as being damaged. They tell you what to do, or as the case may be, what not to do. According to the imperatival version of representationalism, developed most famously by Colin Klein and also Manolo Martinez, the pain associated with a broken ankle isn't telling you that the ankle is injured. Instead, it's telling you what to do or what not to do with it. It's telling you to protect it by not putting your weight on it. So, there's a challenge for representationalism that comes from bodily sensations. There are also a number of responses that might be made within the representationalist camp, quite different responses as to how to accommodate bodily sensations within the representationalist paradigm. It's the third challenge to representationalism that, in my view, is the most serious, the most problematic. And it comes from moods, or rather the experiential dimension of moods. As Angela Mendelevici has noted, moods, to use in her lovely phrase, throw a wrench in the representationalist project, for they don't seem to be about anything. Emotions typically, perhaps always, have objects. One's angry at a perceived insult, excited about an upcoming vacation, or worried about one's health. But moods don't have that kind of object-centered focus. you might simply wake up cheerful. If asked what you're happy about, you might simply be lost for words. As far as you can tell from the inside, your jovial mood, your happy mood, your mood of elation isn't directed towards anything in particular. A similar point applies to waking up feeling melancholic or depressed. Sadness often has an object, but one can simply feel sad, deflated, miserable, without feeling sad, deflated, or miserable about anything in particular. Moods, the phenomenology of moods, don't seem to be in the business of saying how things are. What account of moods might representationalists give? Well, I think there are basically two kinds of proposals on offer. Some representationalists argue that moods represent physiological states in much the way in which bodily sensations, hunger, thirst, pain, nausea do. This is Michael Tye's position. Tye argues that moods represent departures from the functional equilibrium that characterizes our normal bodily state. We might call this kind of account, this kind of representationalist account of mood, an inward-facing account, because it treats moods as representing the internal states of one's body. Other representationalists argue that moods represent features of one's environment, and that they have more in common with perceptual experiences than they do with bodily sensations. Unlike perceptual experiences, or ordinary perceptual experiences, which ascribe properties to particular objects, moods on this account have a global focus. Their objects are near all-inclusive and undifferentiated, as Annette Bayer once put it. We might call this the outward-facing account of moods, for it supposes that moods are in the business of representing the state of the world rather than the state of the bodily milieu. Here's a lovely quote from Robert Solomon that captures the outward-facing account of moods quite elegantly. Euphoria, melancholy, and depression, he writes, are not about anything in particular, although some particular incident might well have set them off. They are about the whole of our world, or indiscriminately, about anything that comes our way, casting happy glows or somber shadows on every object and incident of our experience. Now, it seems to me that there are a number of critical questions that could be put to both the inward-facing view and the outward-facing account. For example, we could ask proponents of the inward-facing account how it captures the phenomenal differences between moods. Why does one kind of departure from functional equilibrium feel like, for example, euphoria, whereas another kind of departure feels like melancholy or depression? With respect to the outward-facing account, we could ask what exactly it is for a mood to cast a happy glow or a somber shadow on one's environment. What must the world be like in order for such an experience to be vertical or to represent things as they are? But it seems to me there's an objection that applies to both the inward-facing and outward-facing accounts, which is the most problematic for the representationalist, and that's this. Whatever content moods have doesn't seem to me to be the right kind of content to account for phenomenal character. Here's why. If the content of moods is to explain phenomenal character, then that content, intuitively, must be available to the subject. This condition is met in perceptual context. For perceptual content is available to the subject. For example, an agent can match a visually presented object with another object of the same shape or the same color, the same size. But whatever representational content moods have, it doesn't seem to be available to the agent. It doesn't seem to be able to inform thought and action in the same way that perceptual content does. In other words, if moods have representational content, that content would appear to be subpersonal rather than personal. It's content for particular cognitive modules, particular subsystems within the agent, and not for the agent as a whole. But in that case, it's not clear how appeals to that kind of content might account for the phenomenal character of moods, for phenomenal character is clearly a personal level phenomenon. So that's my main worry with any of the representationalist accounts of moods. Let's briefly take stock before I turn to the final section of this lecture. Taking my cue from this wonderful paper by Kathleen Akins, we've been looking at what I've called the representational response to Nagel's claim that science won't enable us to figure out what it's like to be a battle or any other kind of creature with alien phenomenology. And we've seen that there are two strands to the representationalist response. The first idea is that representational content is scientifically scrutable. And the second is that all forms of phenomenal character are fixed by representational content. I've been calling that idea unrestricted representationalism. We've also looked at three kinds of challenges to unrestricted representationalism: a challenge from secondary qualities like color and flavor, a challenge from bodily sensations, and a challenge from moods. And what I've suggested is that I think it's the phenomenology of mood that poses the most serious challenge to unrestricted representationalism. But suppose that the representationalist can meet these challenges. And indeed, let's suppose that it can meet all of the challenges that it faces, including those that I haven't discussed here. If all forms of phenomenal character can indeed be captured in terms of representational content, and if representational content can itself be understood scientifically, would we then have a viable response to Nagel's challenge? Would that be enough to, as it were, address Nagel's challenge on his terms? In the last 10 or so minutes of this lecture, I want to consider two reasons one might give for answering that question in the negative. That is, two reasons for thinking that the representational response kind of misses the point of Nagel's challenge. The first is this: representationalism as such says nothing about which representations are or give rise to experience. For the notion of representational content that it appeals to abstracts away from issues of consciousness. It is, as it were, a notion of representational content that applies equally to conscious perception and unconscious perception, to conscious thought and unconscious thought. But without an account of which representations are conscious, representationalism won't be able to tell us what it's like to be a bat, even if it can give us a full analysis of the bat's representational capacities, because we won't know which of these capacities give rise to experience and which don't. Note that the worry here isn't a worry about whether there is anything it's like to be a bat. It's not quite the creature question that we noted at the start of this lecture. We're presupposing that that issue has been addressed. The worry, rather, is about which of a bat's representational contents impinge on or feed into or give rise to phenomenology, and which operate independently of consciousness, which operate outside of conscious awareness. So that's the first challenge. I think it's a genuine challenge, but I also think it's one that ought to be amenable to the natural kind approach, to the resources provided by the natural kind approach. More carefully, if the natural kind approach has the resources to distinguish conscious creatures from unconscious ones, then it seems to me it should also have the resources to distinguish conscious representations from unconscious ones. In fact, you might even argue that the natural kind approach is, in the first instance, best directed towards the question of what distinguishes conscious representations from unconscious ones, and then, perhaps only then, turn towards the question of what distinguishes conscious creatures from unconscious ones. At any rate, I think the first challenge is an important one. It's a real one. But I don't think it represents a distinctive challenge from the challenge posed by the creature question. A second reason for thinking that the representationalist response misses the point of Nagel's challenge seems to me much more serious, much more troublesome. Put most bluntly, the worry is that knowing what an experience represents doesn't tell us what it's like to have that experience, even if representational content fixes or determines phenomenal character. To appreciate this worry, consider the examples of alien phenomenology that we considered earlier, or consider the one particular example, the example of birds such as kestrels who were able to perceive ultraviolet colors. Even if you know what features of the world ultraviolet perception allows a kestrel to experience, to represent, there is clearly an intuitive sense in which you don't thereby know what it's like to be a kestrel. And in fact, when you think about it, Nagel, in his discussion of the bat, seems to allow that we can know what it is that bats represent via echolocation, but he clearly doesn't think that knowing that information is enough is going to deliver knowledge of what it's like to be a bat. So what's going on here? Why does an appeal to representationalism kind of look like it's in danger of missing the point of Nagel's challenge? I think there are a couple of diagnoses of why the appeal to representationalism doesn't seem to engage with Nagel's challenge on its own terms. Here's one. The first diagnosis involves the idea that knowledge of what it's like isn't a kind of propositional knowledge. It's not something that might be mediated by concepts. Even if experiential character is in some sense exhaustively representational or is fixed by representational content, knowing what it's like to be in a particular kind of experiential state might not be a matter of grasping propositions. That's the idea here. Well, what does phenomenal knowledge, knowing what it's like to be in an experiential state, involve if it's not a kind of phenomenal knowledge? It's a matter of debate. It's a difficult issue. Perhaps some people have suggested it's a matter of acquaintance, a kind of direct contact with concrete states, much in the way in which knowing Paris involves direct acquaintance with Paris rather than a grasp of Paris-related propositions. Perhaps it's a kind of know-how. Perhaps phenomenal knowledge involves a kind of possession of abilities, much in the way that knowing how to ride a bike involves the possession of abilities and not a grasp of propositions. Another possibility, another diagnosis of what's going on, allows that phenomenal knowledge might be propositional in some sense, but holds that in order to grasp the relevant propositions, one must employ a special kind of concept, what's come to be known as a phenomenal concept. Although the term phenomenal concept is a relatively recent one, the notion of a phenomenal concept is familiar enough. It's the concept of an experience that categorizes experiences of that type in terms of what it's like to be in those states. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, although there's disagreement about precisely how phenomenal concepts should be understood, what kinds of entities they are, it's widely held that one of the distinguishing features of a phenomenal concept is that they have distinctive acquisition conditions. Roughly speaking, you can't acquire a phenomenal concept unless you've actually had an experience of the kind to which the relevant concept applies, or at least one that's very similar to it. And that's not typically true of other kinds of concepts. You can acquire the concept hepatitis without having had hepatitis. You can acquire the concept airplane without having seen an airplane or been in an airplane. But if phenomenal concepts can be acquired only on the basis of first-person acquaintance with their reference, and if phenomenal knowledge requires phenomenal concepts, then it follows that phenomenal knowledge will be restricted to individuals who have actually had the relevant kinds of phenomenal states. In other words, knowledge of what it's like to be a radically different kind of creature would simply not be accessible to us. Now, although these two diagnoses are superficially quite distinct, one of them appeals to the idea that phenomenal knowledge is propositional and involves concepts. The other one denies that phenomenal knowledge is propositional and involves concepts. In the current context, they've got a lot in common, for they both converge on the idea that the kinds of concepts that the representationalist can appeal to, that representationalism can deliver, won't provide phenomenal knowledge. For the concepts that the representationalist will appeal to won't be phenomenal concepts. So where does this leave us? To what degree does the representationalist response really address Nagel's challenge? Well, here's where I think we're left. There is something right in the thought that representationalism doesn't provide a full response to Nagel's challenge on its own terms. As we've noted, we might know exactly what properties the kestrel represents when it experiences ultraviolet colors, but we won't know exactly what it's like to be a kestrel. Being magically transformed into a kestrel and acquiring the capacity to see ultraviolet colors would intuitively teach us something that one couldn't learn merely by figuring out what features of the world kestrels are perceptually sensitive to. At the same time, it does seem to me that the representationalist response would, if successful, deliver as good an answer to the character question as one might reasonably hope for. After all, if what it's like to be a certain type of creature is determined by which aspects of the world that creature is experientially sensitive to, then one does indeed learn something about what it's like to be the relevant type of creature by learning about what aspects of the world that creature can represent, even if one is not thereby able to imagine from the inside what it's like to be that kind of creature. And the fact that there might be principled limits on the kind of imaginative access we have to the phenomenal perspective of other kinds of creatures is perhaps not all that surprising. After all, we already know from fundamental physics, from mathematics, that advances in our understanding of reality aren't always accompanied by an expansion in what it is that we find readily imaginable. So, if an adequate response to Nagel's challenge were required to provide us with the capacity to imagine what it would be like to be a bat, then that representationalist response would, I think, be a clear failure. But it seems to me that that's not what's required of an adequate response to Nagel. We can, I think, hope to understand the phenomenal perspective of other kinds of creatures that doesn't also deliver the ability to imaginatively put oneself in their shoes. And representationalism, I suggest, offers us the most promising account of what that kind of grasp might consist in. So, this brings to an end a series of lectures on the problem of other minds. My aim hasn't been to provide a comprehensive treatment of every aspect of the problem of other minds. Even if I wanted to, I think that would be beyond my abilities, but to provide you with a framework that might be useful for tackling some of the central problems raised by consciousness as it might occur in other types of creatures. I hope you've enjoyed these lectures and have found them stimulating. Thank you very much for listening.